Well, thanks for coming to the workshop. My name is Vincent Emanuele. I'm located here in Michigan City, Indiana. Short background, was in the United States Marine Corps from 2002 to 2006, went to Iraq twice as a squad automatic machine gunner, became politicized during my second deployment, refused a third deployment, came home and immediately joined the anti-war movement and Iraq Veterans Against the War and Veterans for Peace. Throughout that period, attended a ton of anti-war demonstrations, testified to Congress, huge mobilizations during that period. Saw Obama come along. A lot of energy from the anti-war movement sort of got sucked up into that campaign in 2008. Quickly following that, we saw the rise of the Tea Party, right-wing response to Obama. We also saw a left-wing response in Madison, Wisconsin, which predated Occupy. 125,000 people in Madison, Wisconsin in early 2011, right around the same time as the Arab Spring. So massive mobilizations all over the world. Then we see Occupy in September of that year, changing the conversation, but the structures not changing. So in other words, while we have this influx of left-wing mobilization following the Tea Party, following Madison, following Occupy, then leading up to Ferguson, Missouri, where we were with a contingent of Black Lives Matter activists from Gary, Indiana, huge mobilizations. Then we saw Bernie come along in 2015, 2016, again, huge mobilization around his campaign, but unable to win. Donald Trump gets elected. A number of us go to Standing Rock, and at Standing Rock for the occupation and protest, it became very clear to us that we were seeing the same sort of cycle over and over again, that the same number of activists, some of the same faces in the same places showing up over and over again to the same mobilization. So we're seeing massive mobilizations, Madison, Occupy, Black Lives Matter, Bernie. At the same time, the right continues to win. They win Congress in 2010, they win the Senate in 2014, they pass Citizens United, right to work legislation. We could go on and on. There's been like a last decade of right-wing political victories, not left-wing political victories. As a result, at Standing Rock, following the election of Donald Trump, a number of us asked the question, what are we doing wrong? What is happening here is not obviously what we'd like to see. So we're doing something wrong. We're not winning. What we learned, I think, in that period was that, at least the conclusion we came to, was that we needed a physical space and that we could not allow places like Northwest Indiana or states like Indiana, Michigan, Ohio, Wisconsin to fall into right-wing political movements forever, that we couldn't allow these areas to drift to the right and just focus our energy in the Chicagos of the world, in the New Yorks, Oakland, Portland, San Francisco, Seattle, et cetera, that wasn't going to cut it, that we needed a strategy in Rust Belt red states in order to win. And so we decided to open a community center and a cultural center here in Michigan City, Indiana. I've had the opportunity to work with political movements in Latin America, in Australia, in Europe, and beyond. And it was very clear to me that one of the sort of necessary infrastructures to making political movements happen are spaces. So in 2016, that you needed a location, a union hall, a church. Sometimes progressive churches play this function. But to have a sort of secular space that people could go to, we use the space for any number of things. So over the years, we've used it for everything from an organizing center for local activities, environmental activists, Black Lives Matter activists, Syrian people who are working with Syrian refugees, all the way to local teachers and so on, who've used the space as an organizing center. We also use the space to provide direct services. We have soup kitchens, we have clothing drives, we have community banquets. We held felony expungement programs for people who are trying to get felonies off of their records. We also have a number of cultural events. So we have art installations and live music events and poetry slams and all kinds of activities to bring people in the door who otherwise would never come in the door if we were just promoting the political end of what we're doing. And particularly in an area like Michigan City, where I live, which is a very sort of deindustrialized Rust Belt town, 30% Black, with a coal-fired power plant on the shores of Lake Michigan and a casino that takes advantage of the poor and working class people in the area and is one of our only sources of income for the city coffers. We also have a maximum security prison that's located 2 miles outside of the center of the city, the Indiana State Prison, which is the oldest prison in the state, where I think over a couple dozen people now currently sit on death row. We have gun violence problems, we have opioid addiction problems, and our city in Michigan City is not unlike hundreds or thousands of Rust Belt cities or deindustrialized towns throughout the United States. So that's the context in which we're operating. There is no progressive political infrastructure where we live. The Democratic Party is a shell of its former self and really functions as this sort of like hobby entity for these like professional class people to kind of hang out and pretend like they're playing politics or whatever. The Republican Party is very organized in our area. In the state of Indiana, we have trifecta Republican control. So the Republicans control the lower house, they control the Senate, and they have the governorship. So they have all but made local politics a very difficult and impossible task to achieve as a progressive entity, because if you're just focusing locally in a state like Indiana, you can't really get much accomplished because the state legislature has made it so municipalities have very little control. So municipalities in Indiana cannot raise the minimum wage above the federal minimum wage level. Municipalities in Indiana cannot create sanctuary cities, that's illegal. We cannot decriminalize drugs, that's illegal. We have no fiscal control in the state of Indiana. So municipalities cannot raise property taxes, income taxes, corporate taxes, or sales taxes. So all of the power in Indiana is located in Indianapolis at the state legislature. There is, again, very little you can accomplish in Indiana without a statewide strategy. So what we've been doing, instead of jumping in right away with a self-identified group of sort of activists on the left to try and form a statewide organization, we've decided to really focus locally and regionally here in Northwest Indiana to build up our infrastructure in Michigan City, which means a regular functioning community organizing space in P.A.R.C, the place in which I'm sitting right now while I'm sitting above it in my apartment, a independent political organization called Organized and United Residents of Michigan City. We have, our group is about 50, 60 strong dues paying members. It's a dues paying organization that focuses on electoral campaigns and single issue campaigns. And, now one of the big challenges we face is trying to build that out into a statewide structure. To do so, instead of trying to do it from scratch, we have associated our organization and a lot of our organizers with the Democratic Socialists of America, because we find that they have at least a national organization that's growing. They have, I think, a sophisticated understanding of how to try and combine workplace organizing, single issue campaigns, mobilizing, and electoral politics. And it gives us an opportunity to connect with people throughout the state. If we were doing this from scratch, I would imagine it would take us many, many years to develop the infrastructure to do so. So that's like the general big overlay of like where I'm located, what we've been doing, my experience, and what led to the conclusion that we needed to focus locally. Now, quickly, because I'd like to get into more of a Q&A setting, because I know we have limited time, I'm going to go through the different approaches to organizing. So this is like some inside baseball stuff for people who are aware of Jane McAlevy's work. This will be sort of a refresher. For those who've never heard of Jane McAlevy's work, I highly suggest checking it out, particularly her book, No Shortcuts: Organizing for Power in the New Gilded Age. In my opinion, one of the most important and definitely one of the most influential organizers and books that I've come across in the last 15 years of doing this work. I put it right up there with Francis Fox Piven's Poor People's Movements. In any case, there's fundamental differences between advocacy, mobilizing, and organizing, and I think groups get this wrong a lot. So let's go through this. Some of this will be a repeat of McAlevy's work, but I'll try and cut it off around 12:25, so we still have 20 minutes for Q&A. I might go to 12:30, and then we'll have 15 minutes. So each approach produces different results: advocacy, mobilizing, and organizing. McAlevy argues that progressive movements have experienced a 45 years of failure because progressive movements have shifted away from organizing to a more mobilizing approach. And I think most of you will find, much of this familiar in your own experiences. Advocacy. Okay, so what is the advocacy approach? The advocacy approach doesn't involve ordinary people in any real way. Mostly lawyers, pollsters, researchers, and communications firms are engaged to wage the battle. Though effective for forcing car companies to install seatbelts or banishing toys with components that infants might choke on, this strategy severely limits serious challenges to elite power. Advocacy fails to use the only concrete advantage ordinary people have over elites: large numbers. In workplace strikes, at the ballot box, or in nonviolent civil disobedience, strategically deployed masses have long been the unique weapon of ordinary people. The 1% have a vast armory of material resources and political special forces, but the 99% have an army. Our power comes through our numbers. The theory of power for the advocacy approach is an elite theory of power. Advocacy groups tend to seek one-time wins or narrow policy changes, often through courts or backroom negotiations that do not permanently alter the relations of power. Here, the strategy is litigation heavy spending on polling, advertising, and other paid media, and far too much time spent on social media. The people focus is virtually none. Here, you can think of groups like, say, Greenpeace or the Sierra Club would fit within the advocacy approach. Over the last 40 years, a newer mechanism for change seekers has proliferated. This is called the mobilizing approach. Mobilizing is a substantial improvement over advocacy because it brings large numbers of people into the fight. However, too often they are the same people, dedicated, self-identified activists who show up over and over at every meeting and every rally for all the good causes, but without the full mass of their coworkers or community behind them. The anti-war movement should be very familiar with this approach. This is because a professional staff directs, manipulates, and controls the mobilization. The staffers see themselves, not ordinary people, as the key agents of change. To them, it matters very little who shows up or why, as long as a sufficient number of bodies appear, enough for a good photo op or enough for a good tweet that might earn some media. The committed activists in the photo have had no part in developing a power analysis. They aren't informed about that or the resulting strategy that they're embarking on, but they dutifully show up at the protests that rarely matter to people who hold power. So what is the theory of power under the mobilizing approach? It's primarily an elite theory. Staff or activists set goals with low to medium concession costs, or more typically, set an ambitious goal and declare a win, even when the win has no or only weak enforcement provisions. Backroom secret deal making by paid professionals is very common in this approach. The strategy for the mobilizing approach: campaigns run by professional staff or volunteer activists with no base of power, no actual measurable supporters, that prioritize framing and messaging over base power. Staff-selected authentic messengers, if you ever hear someone using that term, run the other way, represent the constituency to the media and policymakers, but they have very little or no say in the strategy of running a campaign. The people focus in the mobilizing approach: grassroots activists, people already committed to the cause who show up over and over again. When they burn out, and they will burn out, new, also previously committed activists are recruited, and so on and so on. Social media is overly relied on, and activists largely operate in social and cultural bubbles. The third approach, on mobilizing, what would be an example of mobilizing? The Fight for 15 would be a great example for a mobilizing approach. The third approach is organizing. This places the agency for success with a continually expanding base of, very important here, ordinary people. A mass of people who have never been previously engaged, meaning like 95% of Americans, who don't consider themselves activists, again, like 95% of Americans. That's the point of organizing. Organizing means we are talking to people who disagree with us 80% of the time. We are listening 80% of the time. Activists spend 80% of their time with like-minded people, and activists talk 80% of the time. Okay, in the organizing approach, specific injustice and outrage are the immediate motivation, sure, but the primary goal is to transfer power from the elite to the majority, from the 1% to the 99%. Individual campaigns matter in themselves, but they are primarily a mechanism for bringing new people into the process and keeping them involved. The organizing approach relies on mass negotiations to win, rather than closed-door deal-making typical of both advocacy and mobilizing. Ordinary people help make the power analysis. Ordinary people help design the strategy and achieve the outcome. They are essential, and they know they're essential throughout the process. The theory of power under the organizing approach: massive, inclusive, and collective. Organizing groups transform the power structure to favor constituents and diminish the power of their opposition. Specific campaigns fit into a larger power building strategy. They prioritize power analysis, involve ordinary people in it, and decipher the often hidden relationship between economic, social, and political power. Settlement typically comes from mass negotiations with large numbers involved. Strategy: the strategy under an organizing approach: recruitment and involvement of specific large numbers of people whose power is derived from their ability to withdraw labor or other cooperation from those who rely on them. Majority strikes: sustained and strategic nonviolent direct action and electoral majorities. Framing matters, but the numbers involved are sufficiently compelling to create a significant earned media strategy. Mobilizing here is seen as a tactic, not a strategy. The people focus, and this is very key under the organizing approach: organic leaders. The base is expanded through developing the skills of organic leaders who are key influencers of the constituency and who can then, independent of the staff, recruit new people who've never been involved. Individual face-to-face interactions are key in the organizing approach. What do we mean by organic leaders? So if you're at a workplace, let's say you work at a retail store. At that retail store, and in my experience, regardless of what the institution is, the military, a sporting league, local activist groups, a community, a workplace, a church, a housing complex, there's always individuals at that workplace or in your community who are trusted by their fellow workers and their fellow community members more than other people. So in my neighborhood, for instance, we have an old man, Paul Przyblinski, whose family's been here for 3 generations. Everyone on our block knows him, and including most people within the 2nd Ward. Paul might not agree with us on everything, but the key here is to get Paul on our same page. It's not that we ignore Paul because he disagrees with us or he might have abhorrent views that we, don't find tasteful. Our goal is to change Paul's mind and to get Paul on the same page and get him involved with our campaign, knowing that if we get Paul engaged, he's bringing dozens of people from the community with him. There are organic leaders in every community, in every workplace, no matter where you go. There are always people there who are more trusted by their fellow coworkers and neighbors than other people. Those people are the focus of organizing efforts, knowing that when we pull an organic leader into our sphere, when we pull them into our campaign and into our actions, they have a level of credibility and social connections within their workplace or community that goes well beyond what many self-identified activists or radicals will have at that workplace or in that community. Now, sometimes you're fortunate enough that your organic leader is also a self-identified radical. Their goal then is to find other organic leaders, knowing that one person isn't going to bring the whole workplace with them. But each shift, say you're working at a hospital, each shift will have, and you're a nurse, one of those nurses in each shift, if not a number of those nurses in each shift, will have more responsibility than others. They'll be the person that people at that shift come to if they have a problem. Those are the people we're thinking of when we're thinking of organic leaders. Now, the difference, and I'm going to wrap this up here quickly. I want to talk quickly about self-selected groups versus structure-based organizing. Those are 2 fundamentally different things. So McLevy and others, and I agree, they argue that the reason labor and civil rights movements were successful in the 1930s and the 1960s is because they were located in the landscape of what we call a structure-based organizing. The structures were, in the 1930s, the workplace, and in the 1960s, Black churches. Both movements chose organizing as their primary strategy. Mobilizing and advocacy also played a role, but the lifeblood of these movements was mass participation by ordinary people, whose engagement was inspired by a cohesive community bond and a sense of place. The working community on the shop floor, for instance, in the 1930s in the labor movement, and the faith community in the church in the fight for civil rights. McLevy is arguing that structure-based organizing still offers the best chance to rebuild a powerful progressive movement in the United States. Unorganized workplaces and houses of faith remain a target-rich environment. Since organizing's primary purpose is to change the power structure from the 1% to more like, say, the 90 or 95% or 99%, majorities are always the goal. Okay, so the more people, the more power. We are never interested in gaining, like, how can we build up a minority, small number of people who are very loud and disruptive? No, that's not the goal of the organizing approach. But again, we're not just organizing any people. And the word majority isn't just a throwaway word on a flip chart. It is a specific objective that must be met. In structure-based organizing in the workplace and in faith-based settings, it's easy to assess whether or not you have won over a majority of participants in the given structure to a given cause or an issue. So let's say a workplace or a church will say have 500 workers or 500 parishioners. And to reach a majority or even a supermajority, the quantifiable nature of the bounded constituency allows you to assess your success in achieving your numbers. That's a fancy way of saying that if you're not organizing in a structure, you really don't know if you have the majority. If you're in a self-selected group called Chicagoans Against War, okay, maybe you get 1,000 people to show up to your meeting and you go, man, we got 1,000 people to show up to our anti-war meeting in Chicago. We must have the majority of the city. Well, how do you test that? How do you know? Do you have the majority of fast food workers? Do you have the majority of retail sector workers? Do you have the majority of parents on the west side, the south side, within a specific ward, within a specific precinct, within a specific neighborhood? If you don't know who you're organizing and whether or not you can count those people, it's very hard to determine whether or not you're winning majorities. Now, every 2 to 4 years, we get a chance to see if we're winning majorities expressed through electoral politics, but it's quite clear, I think, to most progressives and leftists that we are not the majority. Progressives and leftists are not winning elections across the United States. So in any case, so we get that. That's just a fancy way of saying that in a structure, you can actually measure how many people do we have with us. And there's ways to do that. So let's say you're in a church and there's 500 parishioners. You can come up with different ways to judge whether or not people are with you. So one example would be we had a local organizing campaign to stop the dumping of coal ash and pollution from the local coal-fired power plant. Within a specific church or a specific synagogue or mosque, you can say, okay, you got 500 people in your church. Great. How many of them are with us? Let's see how many of them will sign a petition. We're just going to have a simple petition. Let's say 120 people sign it. Okay, great. Now, out of those 500, we got 120 people who are willing to sign the petition, but we still need to get over that 250, 300, 350 mark to reach a supermajority. Now we got 120 people who signed a petition. Where do they work? Where do they play? Where do they live? Who do they know? Who are they connected to? Where do their kids go to school? Who do their kids hang out with? What do they do for hobbies on the weekends? All of those questions provide social networks for people, not social media networks, for fuck's sakes, actual social networks. Like, who do these people meet in the real world and who do they interact with in person in the real world? That's what we're interested in. Now, out of those 120 who signed the petition, we're going to try and locate some organic leaders within that 120 people. Who out of the 120 people who signed this petition has the most connections throughout the city, throughout the church? Who out of those 120 people who signed the petition are trusted among their fellow parishioners? If we keep hearing a name come up, oh, have you folks spoken with Rich? Or have you folks spoken with Janine? You know, Janine, you should really speak with. That will happen through the course of doing this sort of investigation into who's on your side and who's not. So then the goal is each step of the way, well, we got 120 people to sign the petition. How do we get 160 people to show up to the local city council meeting? That's the next step. You know, like gradually increasing intensity of actions, also asking a little more of people, and along the way, focusing on those organic leaders who've already signed the 120 who've signed the petition, to get them to bring more people along at each step of the way. Okay, So that's just a quick example of what that looks like. An organizer intending to build movement to maximum power who's approaching a structure or bounded constituency must target and plan to reach each and every person, regardless of whether or not each and every person has any pre-existing interest in the community, organization, or union. I could go on and on about this, but I think I'll open it up because it's already 12:30, so we'll have 15 minutes of Q&A. But I just want to end with this because it's sort of towards the end. I think we need a lot more of sophistication on the left, like real strategic sophistication. There's a lot of moralizing. I think too much over moralizing. I don't think it helps. I don't think it brings people around. In fact, I think it turns people off. And for most people, including myself, after 15 years of doing this work, just being in the struggle isn't good enough for me. I would rather go to the beach like 90% of Americans. If the choice is between be in the struggle for the sake of the struggle, brothers and sisters, because it's the right thing to do, after 15 years, that's not enough to keep me engaged. And that's much longer than most people who walk away because that's not enough for them either. People are in a tough spot in this country. In our experience, in these kind of Rust Belt areas, for people to be engaged with politics, they have to feel not only like there's a real shot at winning something, but that the people involved are involved with a plan. They have some strategy, that they're serious and disciplined about what they're doing. This is not a hobby for working class people. This is not a hobby for poor people. Poor and working class people don't do this type of stuff because it's the right thing to do. Poor and working class people do these things because it's a matter of survival. Either we organize and survive, or we don't organize and we live in this horrific system. So the last thing I'll say is our immediate analysis of what's possible should be grounded in reality. There is no insurrection on the horizon. There is no left-wing armed revolution on the horizon. There is no revolution on the horizon. We should speak openly and honestly about our challenges. Right now in the US, no communist party exists. No socialist party exists. No counterpower left-wing forces exist in the US. The left has no army, militias, paramilitary forces, or militant broad-based unions. And we have no foothold in the police or the military or in Congress. This poses big challenges for the left. How should left-wing movements and organizations relate to these problems? What sort of institutions and organizations should we build, not only to combat the rise of right-wing militarism and all the rest, but also to develop a vision for the future that simply opposing US empire and a US militarism and imperialism isn't enough. We have to have an alternative vision to it. And I think that's where we find ourselves today on the left, under Biden, post-Trump, after the pandemic, or toward the end of the pandemic, however we want to frame that. But yeah, I hope that was useful, and I tried to blow through it as quick as I could. So I hope that wasn't too much or too little.
No, that was great, Vincent. Thank you. It's going to take me a few days and maybe even a few weeks to try to synthesize some of what you were talking about, along with, it was like a perfect 1-2 for me. What I don't know if you were on earlier when Beautiful Trouble was presenting in the plenary, but there are similar threads running through both those conversations. And they're actually threads that have been present in some of my thinking of the last, I don't know, 5 months, 6 months, 2 years, 5 years. I keep wind up looping back to Johnson's Great Society and the mistakes that were made in creating top-down solutions for these people, you folks. This is what I'll do for you, as opposed to listening. You know, this is the grand challenge, right? Is taking communities like ours. You know, I live in a wealthy white community who have access to levers of power, and allowing us to touch those levers of power, but not on our own behalf, right? So organizing. I don't know if, and I don't know if this is McAlevy's work or not, but there was a decision made, a grand fight among unions in the United States, maybe 15 or 20 years ago, whether they were going to focus on political power, take their dues and spend it lobbying Congress, or whether they were going to focus where they actually built their power in the aught years and in the 30s in organizing workplaces. They chose the former, much to their detriment. And now we have 7% union participation instead of 38%. So if I'm hearing that from you, I'm getting it, but it's going to take me a while to synthesize it.
No, could you 100%, David, I totally agree. And just for some context, even in a what is now considered sort of an arch right-wing state like Indiana, in 1972, 41% of workers in Indiana were unionized. We were the 6th largest union dense state in the country. I wanted to ask you real quick, David, and then we'll get to some other folks, but what were some of the threads that were some overlap between the Beautiful Trouble and this presentation? I'm just interested if you remember any specifically.
Yeah, I think very specifically when you're talking about, so the note I just made is we can't win with, quote, here's what I can do for you, right? We have to win by walking into, and I was mostly focused on your conversations in the churches because I'm deeply understanding that is how the Black Civil Rights Movement won its victories, was organizing within communities that already existed. And I think Beautiful Trouble is basically saying to us, what they're really saying is you have to look at your organization and identify where your racist roots are in your organization so that you can develop this anti-racism. But I read that mostly as walking into structures and asking them where are your points of pain and what are your solutions for it. We're happy to be a part of helping you refine those solutions, but we need to hear from you as opposed to telling you, here's how we see, here, we've already built out the strategy. We've got the whole campaign plan. We want you to mobilize 1,000 people and come with us, as opposed to, we haven't planned it at all yet. We want you in the room in the beginning.
Yep, 100%.
Did you, Lizzie, do you agree with that thread between Beautiful Trouble and this?
Yes, I would. I also really like the point you made. This is not a hobby for working class people. This is serious for many people that are really struggling. It's not just about coming to meetings and doing one-off actions, but we need to be strategic about how we're actually going to make the change that will change people's lives. And that's just critically important to our movement. I had a couple questions. So the majority of people to get on your side, that's a lot of people. And I'm wondering about the structures in place to organize all of the people necessary to do that. I wrote down the couple of authors you mentioned. Would that be a good place to start to explore that more?
Oh, absolutely. I think the best examination of structure-based organizing versus non-structure-based and the interplay between mobilization and organizing is Francis Fox Piven and Richard Cloward's book, Poor People's Movements, and also Jane McAlevy's book, No Shortcuts, Organizing for Power in the New Gilded Age. I think those two books provide sort of the best overview of that interplay between the different approaches. Yeah, no doubt about it. And, I will say this, sort of David and Liz are sort of touching on somewhat of a similar thread here. It's true that people have to be in the room. It's true they should be there from the beginning of developing a power analysis, developing a strategy. But it's also true in our experience that a lot of poor and working class people do like it when you come to them with some options. So in other words, starting from scratch sometimes it also can be a way to turn people off because they go, wait a minute, man, I'm working 2-3 jobs. I don't have time to sit in 60 hours of strategy sessions, but I do want to have some decision-making power and I want to feel like I have a say-so in where the hell we're going. But please give me a little bit of your knowledge and experience. You guys have been doing this for a while. A lot of people are open to that. As long as, like David said, it's not, here's the plan, here's the idea, now plug your people in best you can. That doesn't work. But on the flip side, it does help to have some options for people. So that way, locally, people have said to us, we want the city council to raise the minimum wage. We've had to explain to people the city council in Michigan City doesn't have the power to raise the minimum wage. Here are some other options for dealing with an issue like that. We need a statewide campaign. Here's what that could look like. People appreciate that because they don't want to be led along on something just because we're happy to have them, only to find out a year or two from now, there's no real strategy or credible plan for winning. I'm just going to go back to, watching football and chilling out because it makes sense to do that instead of waste my time here.
Yeah, you had mentioned the Wisconsin, the reaction to Scott Walker in Wisconsin. And yes, that was, I was there, and that very quickly got co-opted by the Democratic Party. And there we were out in the streets with that recall effort, when looking at it in retrospect, it probably should have been a general strike effort instead of a recall effort. And the recall effort failed.
Yeah.
The political approach failed. But, oh well, we tried something. The other thing, I participate in a workers' center in the western suburbs, and you mentioned about the locating the leaders and will those leaders go with you? Well, yet there was one project in which, yes, we did. Well, the leaders put themselves out on the line and they were fired from their workplace. They eventually got, there were 3 of them, they eventually got a $2,500 settlement, each mediated by the NLRB, and they found other jobs. But the employer achieved the goal. They're not there to organize anymore. So sometimes it's really frustrating. And you didn't use the word vanguard, but it's almost there. It's we, the people who are a little bit vanguardist, are not the ones taking the risks. And sometimes I think we have to keep that in mind more than we do. So could you react to those things?
Yeah, I mean, as far as the worker center is concerned, I would have to know more of the details. I think a lot of salting efforts often fail because people go about them the wrong way. If I were going to encourage anyone to do any salting at a workplace, I'd tell them to spend the first year or 2 just getting to know people and not open their mouths one bit about politics. That's a big mistake they made in Bessemer with Amazon, which is why they got their asses handed to them. In Wisconsin, I agree. But I disagree that a general strike was an option. Of those 120,000 people who are in Madison, Wisconsin, half of them were not from Wisconsin. So we would need people from Madison to actually partake in that. I do agree with you that energy was co-opted. But to me, this gets back to, why do these mobilizations pop up, fizz out, or pop up and get co-opted? I would argue that's because we're not doing the organizing in between those mobilizations. So if we're not organizing in between those mobilizations and coming into those mobilizations with a collective, coherent body of people who have a similar shared vision, with similar shared goals, with an idea of what kind of tactics and strategies we're going to use, very difficult to keep people in the streets. Even more difficult than keeping them in the streets is keeping them in the streets with a real viable strategy. The last thing, as far as vanguardism goes, I mean, no, look, we live here. I mean, I live in a working class neighborhood, where there's like bar fights and drive-bys down the street from my block. So like, I'm in the shit. I don't consider myself a vanguard. I consider myself part of the working class. Any risk we ask anyone to take, we take the same risks. We're not telling people to go salt at their workplace if we don't have people in the organization who are also salting at that workplace or other places. We're not about that at all. And I don't believe necessarily that there is like a vanguard that exists on the left, because it's a sort of like incoherent groups in the United States, largely sectarian, that consider themselves whatever Leninists or Trots, or like all these groups are so isolated. They have no power. They have no connection to their local communities. They're like really fringe stuff. And so I don't speak in those terms. To me, there is no such thing as a Leninist or a Stalinist or a Trotskyist. Like, these in the United States in 2021, those are book clubs. Like, those are not real things that exist. Those aren't real political organizations that have a social base to them. So I think we should operate in reality, and I think we should reject any kind of like vanguardism. I'm not interested in that at all. In fact, it's directly opposed to the very methods of the organizing approach.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes it's frustrating, though. I mean, I'm also DSA in the western suburbs here. But to be a democratic socialist in a country where the majority still have the bugaboo from the Cold War, think democratic socialists want to take us straight into Stalinism. So
Yeah, for older people. I think that's true for older people. If you look at the polls, younger people, my age, 35 and younger, that's totally different. 62% of whom have a positive or favorable view of socialism. I mean, those older generations and those ideas about the Soviet Union, I mean, this new generation of people did not grow up with the Soviet Union or any kind of Red Scare or any of that stuff, really. So, I mean, I agree with you. With the older generations, it's still a challenge, though it looks like if you frame the issues not with that language. So if you don't use socialism and batter people over the head with it, but if you talk about the issues and if you talk about the actual policies, people are much more likely, we've learned in Michigan City, to gravitate towards those politics. Whereas people might hear the label and go, I don't know, I don't know if I want to join this. What does that mean? I'm not sure. I've heard bad things. I'm not, it makes more sense, I think, the way that Bernie did, to talk about the issues, knowing that the majority of people are with us on the issues, and to sort of leave the ideological rhetoric and the sort of like radical rhetoric to the side, because I don't find it very useful or helpful.
Yeah, I think one of the most important things that we're going to see, the battle that we're going to witness in either January, March, or April, whenever it happens in Congress, is this re-upping of the child care tax credit, right? This is it was a little bit reported, and then sort of nobody's talking about it, which is fine with me that they're not talking about it. But this is the first major shot across the bow since the 1930s to say that this is where government belongs, right? We have a child poverty problem in this country. We can cut it in half. $600 for every, or $300 a month for every child, $360 for every child under 6 years old. And most importantly, we don't care what you do with the money. That's the single, and that's where that fight's going to come. The Republicans are going to say, yeah, we can re-up it, but it can only be targeted here, there, which doesn't give working class families the credit that they get to make good decisions with their own money. I mean, I think this is such an important thing to be able to build on, and I think that does certainly touch people's lives in a very real way.
I agree 100%, David. And thank you guys for the talk. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thanks,
I hope you found it useful.
Thank you so much.